It is 9 o'clock on the West Coast, so we're going to kick off the meetup for Thursday, February 20th edition, depending on where you are in the world. Might be the 21st if you're from the future. Basically, today what we're going to be looking at is user-defined formatting in Power and BI, both Antony Catella. But before we get to that part, we got a couple of different things, or a couple other things to talk about quickly first. First off, I just want to throw out a big shout out to the sponsors that make all these events happen, that organize them and host them. Skillwave.training is my training platform that I run, where we have awesome content on Excel and Power BI. You should definitely check out our courses if you want to get better at these technologies. Excel Guru is the parent company of Skillwave, and also the creator and distributor of Monkey Tools, my Excel add-in to help you build better data models faster and generally help you use Excel faster. Our next meetups that we have coming up in a couple of weeks at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, I'm going to be leading the meetup on Stop Reinventing the Wheel, Bank Your Excel Knowledge. We're going to be looking at how we can actually store different things like formulas and queries and measures to reuse them across multiple workbooks and work generally a little bit faster with the things that we've built ourselves. Our next Power BI track, we've got Juliana Smith is going to be joining us, and she's going to be talking about implementing alternative accessible colors in Power BI, so a little bit of color theming and whatnot. That is going to be at 9 a.m. Pacific time, although you'll notice that we're actually switching to daylight savings time before we get to March 20th there. I think it's around the 9th, I think, is when we switch this year, if I'm correct. Just a quick note on Monkey Tools. What's happened in the Monkey Tools side of things? Our last sort of major release was from about a week ago. I just got a note on my watch that says, Ken, we talked about changing this to 9 a.m. I'm like, all right, fair enough. So what's new in Monkey Tools? Our BiblioMonkey, we've actually added a new feature here to be able to import items from MTBM files. This is a Monkey Tools BiblioMonkey file format. Basically, the concept behind this is when people have these awesome Lambda functions, you can actually hopefully grab an MTBM file and import it directly into your BiblioMonkey so they're ready to go. And that is a brand new feature that's free to everyone. We also have the ability to export files or items from your BiblioMonkey into MTBM files. This is a pro license version thing. It does work on the trial as well, but this will allow you to build some pretty cool things that you can reuse and share with other users. In a couple of weeks at the next meetup, I will actually be looking at that, and we will be sharing how some of that kind of stuff works. Naturally, of course, with every Monkey Tools update, we have a huge amount of bug fixes that we always put into this thing. Not to say that there's a huge amount of bugs, but I'm always looking to try and squash the ones that we find. If you're interested in learning more about Monkey Tools, you can take our free course here, hosted on the skillwave.training platform. It's totally free registration, and it will walk you through all the features in Monkey Tools, whether they're free or pro, so you can understand just how complex and how big this add-in is and the amazing things it can bring to your game. The next kickoff call for my Excel Fundamentals Academy is on March 12th. This is a comprehensive program that teaches people how to fill in some knowledge gaps, right? Learn some different formulas that they can use across Excel, teach you the fundamentals of pivot tables and data visualizations, and get you into Power Query. It's a great training program if you're looking to just sort of, set a good skill base across the organization for how to use Excel properly. Also gives you access into our Ask Ken Anything sessions. Got a great comment from a user that was actually part of one of these yesterday. Said, I really took this with a grain of salt because I've never been able to interact with the instructor live before in one of the online courses I've taken. That is what we offer here. So it's kind of a cool thing. If you're interested in checking that out, you can do so at the link that we have on screen. And this right now is being uploaded to the Meetup site in the PDF format, so you can always grab them from there. The next kickoff of my Self-Service BI Academy is also on March 12th. This is my premier training program where we talk about Excel, we talk about Power BI. We've got some really advanced Power BI concepts in there, as well as Excel concepts. You'll learn Power Query, you'll learn dimensional modeling, you'll learn your DAX measures, as well as how to share and different things like that as well. This is a huge program. It has up to about 16 weeks of material if you want to go and consume it on a 4 hours per week basis. Gives access to the ACA sessions, my books, software, everything. Everything is in this one. So if you're interested, you can check out the link here as well. This meetup, along with every meetup that we do here, is recorded and posted to the Skillwave YouTube channel. So that will be done in about 24 to 48 hours after the show is complete here. We'll get those posted, and we will send out your notification on Meetup, so you'll get notified right away once it is live if you're not already subscribed to the YouTube channel. The last thing that I want to throw out there is if you'd like to come and speak to our meetup, we would love to have you. Just fill out the little form here and we will get in touch with you and get you onto our stage. And I think at that point, that is what I have for my opening here. So I'm going to turn it over to our friend Joseph Yeates, who is going to talk about what is new in Power BI for January.
Awesome.
So let me just stop the sharing there.
That is great. I am not able to share my screen.
Should I make you a presenter here? Yeah, let's do that. I should probably do the same for Anthony too, eh? There we go.
Happy to be the guinea pig or canary, or whichever one.
All works. Hopefully not the canary. There we go. All right, we're good. I can see your screen.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Ken. And thank you, everyone, for being here for the first Power BI meetup group of 2025. So yeah, as Ken said, I'm going to be presenting what's new in Power BI for January. The February release hasn't come out yet, and we didn't have anything in December. So although it's been a couple months now since I presented what's new in Power BI, we only have 1 month worth of updates to go through. So as always, I like starting with the Power BI updates blog post, looking at the January one, where it reviews all of the different features that have either come into preview for this version, have previously been in preview and are going into general release, or maybe they're in preview and are still in preview with just some updates and feature enhancements. So typically, I like spending my time in this reporting category, just because I like going in and designing reports and looking at some of these reporting elements. And I'm going to look at 2 of these a little bit later on. But where I want to start today is probably the biggest update that we've had, I would say, in at least a year and a half, probably. For me, it's the most impactful since the DAX query view, which I know I cover almost every month in what's new in Power BI, just because there's so many cool things and new things coming to that view. But we have a brand new view. So we went years and years and years with just 3, and then we got 4 like 2 years ago, and now we have 5. So this is very, very exciting for me. The tabular model definition language, or Tyndall scripting experience preview. So if I just jump down to that section in the blog post, we now have the ability to, as it says here, script, modify, apply changes to the semantic model directly in the Power BI desktop application. So previously, some of this functionality was available in third-party tools. We actually did a presentation at this meetup group when we were seeing how we could do continuous integration, continuous development using the Power BI project file extension, and using tools like Visual Studio Code and using like Azure repos to programmatically control some of these elements and script these elements for our semantic model. And now we have the ability to do that directly in the desktop application, which I think is really cool. So why don't I jump into Power BI to see exactly what this looks like and what it means. So starting just in the canvas view, we'll come back to this view in just a second, but down the left-hand side of the screen now, where we had 3, now we have the DAX query view and the Tyndall view. So I'm just going to go into here. It's a new view. And what we have is the ability to look at, within this model view on the right-hand side, everything contained within our semantic model. So we have like measures, relationships between our tables, the individual tables that make up our semantic model. And what I can do is I can just right-click on the entire semantic model, and we have this option to script Tyndall to. And we can either go to our clipboard, which is useful, but I'm just going to go to script tab for now to start. And now we can see we have the definition of everything within our semantic model. So we can see we have like our model definition at the top, and then we have our individual tables that are in our semantic model, and then the columns within those tables. And we have information about the columns and the tables within those as well. And if I scroll down to a little bit further, just past all these things, within the tables, we can also see the underlying Power Query M code that define those tables, which is really cool. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. And if I scroll down a little bit further, we can also see the relationships between our tables. So now, instead of going in and using interface features to update like relationships or going into the Power Query editor to update our M code, we can now do this directly in a script editor within the Power BI desktop app. And we're able to not only view all the definitions of our semantic model, but we can go in and update these as well. So this is like everything in our semantic model, but we are also able to just script individual items of our semantic model to this Tyndall view as well. So if I were to take like one of my dimension tables, script Tyndall to script tab, this works just like the DAX query view. We just pops open like another tab along the bottom of the page. And here we have this Tyndall language view of our dim position table. So this is a little bit easier to see. We have the M code that underlies it. We have the column definition as well. So what this allows for, which I think is really cool, is we can copy and paste this Tyndall definition between Power BI files. So rather than like grabbing this M code as an example, going into another Power BI file, copy pasting that in, okay, then maybe I have to copy the definition of all the measures that reside on that table, paste them into the new file. I can kind of just do everything at once in one step. If I just want to grab all of this, copy it, and if I head into a new Power BI file, I can paste this in. And if I press apply, it throws up an error, but that's okay because we have this nice, we have these nice, actually meaningful error messages. So I see it's this change property thing that is that's causing an issue. So if I get this change property, I can select all of them, just remove them. So just like how we can select multiple things in the DAX query view, we can do the same thing here. Let's try running that again. And we see that it is successful. So now I have a new table in my data model, which I didn't have before. And I get some messages up at the top that there are pending changes to our queries, and some of the tables have incomplete or no data. So if I apply those changes, and if I refresh my data now, and if I go back into my report page, previously I didn't have any tables in my data model, and now I have a new table with the columns, and I was able to quickly copy paste that between two different Power BI files. So very exciting, can really help speed up development. Even if you're not doing this programmatically, we can still do it sort of manually, but it's a lot quicker development experience. I'm just going to head back to the blog post now. And one thing I want to call out is that there is a dedicated documentation for working with this new Tyndall view in Power BI desktop. So it goes into a lot more detail than I've had time here. But one of the things I do want to call out that I found very useful is down towards the bottom. We have common use cases for the Tyndall view. And this can really help drive home just how important this new view can be in Power BI. So things like I want to rename some of my table prefixes, but my model has like hundreds of tables. You can do this quickly in the Tyndall view within the Power BI desktop app now. I need to modify my Power Query code that defines some of the tables in my data model, but I don't want to have to trigger a refresh of all that data. Now we can do that within the Tyndall view. We can update that Power Query code, and the data won't refresh automatically until we prompt to refresh. We can switch the storage modes of table from direct query to import. And also importantly is we can do version control on our semantic model as well. So if we do want to make updates to like measure definitions or table definitions or relationships between tables, like really anything within our semantic model, we can now take a backup of like snapshots of what our semantic model looked like at a certain point in time. We can save that, we can make our updates, and if we need to like roll back to anything, we can now do that as well. So this is this really makes development a lot easier. It can take it up to really a whole new level that we have the ability to define with a code editor view some of these elements of our semantic model. So I know that was only sort of like a 5 to 10 minute overview, but if you are constantly developing reports in Power BI, I would really recommend checking out this documentation and turning on this preview feature just so you have more control when you build your Power BI reports. But back to some of the reporting features that are my favorite for this month. I said we're going to circle back to the reporting views. So the two I'm going to look at for a couple more minutes now are the enhancement to the text slicer, which we looked at in November, I think. So we had some new functionality coming to that slicer that's in preview. And we also have enhancements to the tree map visual, which someone may correct me in the chat, but I don't think we've had updates to this visual like ever, as far as I can remember. It's always just been exactly the same, and it's been quite far inferior to the Tableau version of the same visual. And with some of these updates, it's getting a little bit better and more useful. But let's jump back into Power BI and we can see what I mean. So I just have this dashboard page or report page here. And we have this tree map visual down here at the bottom. So we have categories which are reflected in the different colors and details within each of these categories. So a tree map really tries to make like these square blocks based on some sort of value that you want to analyze. So let's just open up the build tab and the format tab. And what we have now is the ability to define within this layout format section, the tiling method. So previously, we've always had this squarified method, which is what we're seeing here. There's an algorithm that tries to make all of the individual points within the tree map nice and square, so we don't get too many like long rectangles rather that take up a lot of space. And we have two different tiling methods that we can choose from now. We have the binary method, which from what I've tested so far, usually looks quite similar to the squarified method. We see when I flick back and forth, it does change slightly. So it is a little bit of a different algorithm that creates this. And in the blog post and documentation for this update, it did say that certain data sets you can get more different results. But from what I've seen, it still looks quite similar. And the tiling method that looks quite different is this alternating columns and rows. And so what this does is it sorts data first by columns, as we can see with like the category, and then within rows, which sorts the detail in like ascending order. So this looks quite different than the traditional tree map that we've seen in Power BI up to this point. So it's nice that we have some different tiling methods now. We have more control over the actual display of our tree map. And just for like a formatting option, still within the same layout section, we now have the ability to set space between nodes and between groups within our tree map. So by default, it's 0, everything sort of clumped together. But if I want to add some space between groups, if I just add like 5 pixels of space, we can now separate out those categories in the tree map. And if I wanted to separate between the nodes as well, I can set that to 5, and we're starting to set some space within the individual nodes within those categories of our tree map. And if I flip this back to squarified, this is what it can look like. So rather than have everything clumped together, we can start setting some distance in between the different categories of our tree map. And if I like, maybe let's drop this down a little bit. Maybe I'll keep the space between groups at 4, but between nodes at 2. And we can start getting something, it's just a little bit easier to see those distinct details within each of the categories. So hopefully this is the first of many updates to come for the tree map visual, but I think this is a good start. It's definitely needed some love over the last couple of years, and it's starting to get it. So let's wrap up by looking at the text slicer. So as I said, I looked at this in November, and what this allows us to do is rather than use like a drop-down slicer, we can just type in keywords and we get like partial word matching. So for example, one of the things that I looked at like last month is if I just typed in like MC, and I'm looking at this web name dimension or a column rather from my data model, this filters everything on the report page that just starts with MC. So we see we have like McNeil, MacArthur here. And we have this partial matching. So I don't now have to go and search like just McNeil or MacArthur and these full words. I can just look at like a subset of a string for that. But what's new this month is I have the ability to input multiple values within our text, within this text slicer. So within this visual formatting under slicer settings, we now have the ability to accept multiple values. So if I type in MC again and hit enter, or this like commit arrow, we see that we have MC. If I type in like MA and VA or something like that, we can now see we start to get this collection of items that we're using in our text slicer. We can see the results in our report page. And if I wanted to get rid of like the first one, we can go through there. So a really intuitive experience. This is nice when we're looking at things like employee names that have a high cardinality and like sort of longer strings, and we just want to narrow it down. This is a great feature. I'm starting to implement it more in some of the Power BI reports that I develop. And I'm glad that new functionality is continuing to come out. So this is still in preview. You do need to toggle it on in the options of the report. But if this suits one of your use cases, I would definitely recommend checking it out. But with that, those are my 3 favorite updates from the January release for Power BI. As I say, I cannot emphasize enough. I think the Tyndall view is huge, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. Really reminds me of the Monkey Biblio, what was it, BMTM file, in Excel, the equivalent.
So that's interesting, because as you're showing that, I'm going and reading the documentation. I'm trying to figure out, can I script this to actually apply it live so that I could inject my queries without having to reload Power BI? That's what's been holding me back from actually, putting Monkey Tools into Power BI at all. And I haven't found an answer on that. I don't know if you know, but I may have to reach out to see whether or not that's possible. Because if you can connect from an external tool and apply it live, that opens up some big possibilities. So
that would be cool.
Anyhow, that would be cool. We'll see what happens. Anyhow, Joseph, thanks very much for doing this again. As always, great
Thank
stuff.
you.
And I always learn a ton from watching what you're putting together here. I really appreciate it. So, all right. And at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to turn the stage over to Antony Catella. So, Antony, welcome to VanPUG, and I'll let you share your screen here and then take it away.
Cool. Let me do this. Right. Can you see that?
I can see it perfectly. There we go.
Good. That's the main thing. That's the main concern I normally have. So, anyway, good evening, everybody. And Ken, thanks very much for having me. Great to be on the user group. So tonight's it's evening here in the UK, I know morning in Canada. Is look at user-defined formatting in Power BI. We'll get onto some of what I actually mean by that. But the important thing for people just to look at is that the little creature on the title page is called a chameleon. They found in Africa and in Asia. But one of the key things is just to keep a note of the color of it. So this particular one has got a sort of brown and green coloration to it. We'll get back to that just now. Just a quick overview of myself. I work for a consultancy in the UK. Most of our clients are non-profits, so all the big charities around the world. We work with them, generally developing analytical solutions for them. So one of the things that you will see in the data set tonight is, because I do a lot of work with the nonprofits, is the data set that I've actually got in the Power BI report this current one is actually looking at income and donors. So it's a very different data set to what a lot of people might be accustomed to, sort of thinking about Contosa and the Adventure Works and things like that. So it's something different to work with. And I also co-organize the Devon and Cornwall Microsoft Power BI user group. I'm very passionate about the natural world, and I love my mountain biking and baking in my spare time. I've got my LinkedIn link here, so if people want to link up, that would be great. And then there's also a GitHub repository that I've got here as well. I will be posting the PBEX file that I'm going through on the session now. I'll post it up to the GitHub tonight or tomorrow morning so people can download it and play around with it and do whatever they wish with it. So let's get on to the introduction. So as I said from the first page, is that you had this one chameleon on the first page, which was a brown and green color. You've got two other pictures here. One of them is plain green. Another one is completely brown. Now, one of the fascinating things about chameleons is that this particular species of chameleon, the flat-necked chameleon, is actually found in the Kruger National Park on the east side of South Africa. So it's it's the same area that they found. It's exactly the same species of reptile. But chameleons have this amazing ability to change their colors and their patterns depending on their backgrounds. And so I've seen chameleons where they've been walking along, they might be on sort of a green leaf, and then they move on to sort of a gray tree trunk, and they'll slowly change color over to the more grayer color from camouflage purposes. Whereas your zebras are, that are also found in exactly the same national park in South Africa, are black and white. And that's the same color. It doesn't matter where they found, they are always going to be black and white. They will not change their color pattern. So if you sort of move on towards thinking of that from a Power BI developer point of view, is that generally when we build our reports, or most instances, we'll fix the data label formats. There'll be whole numbers, or there'll be a currency with 2 decimal places. We'll set the data labels to be on or off on visuals. We'll specify the colors of columns. So generally is that, just like the zebra, is that if you're a user of that report, is that everything is fixed. We can't change it. So, but what if we want to allow our users to apply their own formatting to the visuals, depending on their requirements? So let's get on to what I'm talking about. So if I jump onto the next page here, is that this particular one here is that this is what we're aiming to try and get to at the end of the presentation. So for example, in this particular one is that I've got a slicer up at the top here, which changes how the column formatting works. So at the moment, it just is defaulted to show it as blue. Now, what happens if I want to show the highest and lowest columns in my chart? I might want to change it so I show my highest column. What if I wanted to show the years which are above average? Now, what happens if, for example, if I select that option, I might want to show an average line. So where does that fall on the chart? In terms of the display label units, say, for example, is on the left-hand side, my display label says I don't want any labels. What happens if I want to say, I want to change it to show me the income, but I might want to change that income to say, instead of showing the whole numbers, can I show it in thousands? Can I show it in millions? Could I show it in billions if I'm wanting to? Or if you might want to have the other option is what happens if you want to show different labels on your chart? You might want to show a combination of labels. So for example, in this instance here is if I take it back to the auto where I've got the income and I've got the percentage change between each year. It might be that you actually want to show a completely different metric. So for example, this case, I've got income by year, but I'm showing the total number of donors for each year that actually gave that income to the organization. So it's just having that ability to change things. What about the display labels here? So for example, in the income, what if I wanted to show 1 decimal place or 2 decimal places? It gives you a bit more flexibility, gives the users a bit more flexibility to decide what they're wanting to do. So for example, in some of our charts, so one of the key projects that we work on is this benchmarking project. So we've got about 100 different countries, organizations around the world, based on all the different nonprofits. So we've got about 1,400 users, all external users, all coming into our tenancy to come and access that same report So you can imagine how everybody works in a different way. So by allowing people to have this option, do they want to show the labels? Do they not want to show the labels? So for example, on a lot of our reports, we've implemented the feature where people can turn the labels off or turn them on. We've got other options where people can show no decimals, 1 decimal, or 2 decimal places. Because, for example, when we get a bit later on, is, for example, when you're looking at average income per donor, which is often a very key metric for a lot of organizations, particularly the nonprofits, is that some people are not really bothered about the decimal places. They just want to see the whole numbers, whereas other people do want to look at the decimal places. So it gives people that flexibility depending on what they're trying to do. So this is what we're going to try and work towards during the course of this session. So if I start out first by briefly talking about dynamic format strings. So you can create dynamic format strings using calculation groups. So a calculation group, when you create a calculation group, it'll apply that format string to all the measures that you've got within that within those visuals on that page generally. And so you might want to change a particular format, apply number format to all the measures on that page. Now, when I say generally will apply to all the measures, is that you can jump through a few hoops to have certain exceptions to calculation groups. It can be somewhat, calculation groups can cause you issues though, because particularly if you've got dynamic titles in your visuals, which I tend to make a use, I use dynamic titles a hell of a lot in my reports, is that most dynamic titles are text-based. So if you try and apply a calculation group, it's trying to run a calculation on a text field. And so what will happen is your visual will break. And so you then have to apply additional logic within your calculation groups to try and exclude certain measures on your page or on your visual from this calculation group being applied to them. However, they brought out dynamic format strings for measures, which applies a format string to an individual measure. They introduced it in 2023. They made it available in October last year. And so the nice thing about this, it gives you a lot more granular control to applying these dynamic format strings to measures. Now, within your dynamic format strings, you can actually reference the measure name itself or indirectly using the selected measure function. But I'll show you some examples of going both ways in some of the examples that I've got just now. So if we go on to a brief sort of demo as to, well, how do we actually do this? So if I open up here and I look at our baseline measure that I've created. So I've got a measure here. Please let me know if you can't see the DAX, because there's going to be a lot of DAX tonight. Is that this particular baseline measure that I've got is just summing up all the income in the fact table, the income fact table that I've got, and it is all going to be in USD, and I've got the format set to currency currently. Now, to change it to dynamic is that if you click on the drop-down list up at the top here and change it to dynamic, what will happen is on the left-hand side of the DAX measure, you get another option called format. So if I click this drop-down here, is that what will happen is you'll have your original measure, so your original DAX that you've got for that measure, and you've also got the format string for it. Now, what will happen is that so what happens with the Power BI is that the currency format that they use, when you switch it over to format, it's going to use this format string to apply to that, because it just flips it over. I haven't done any changes. That's just the default underlying version of what the default currency format is. Now, what you'll see here is that any negative numbers will have a round brackets put around it. So if we look at the table below here, is that by default, the actual, if I look at, for example, one of the measures that I've got, which is a USD change. So this is looking at income change from year on year, is that by the default format using currency is going to have brackets for all the negative numbers. But what happens if I want to change it to say, I don't actually want brackets, I want to put a minus sign in front of it. So if we look at this particular measure itself, So I'm using a fixed, so this particular one is that I'm using this fixed measure. It's just got a bit of DAX code in it. It's set to currency format, the original base measure that I'm using. And if I switch over to the dynamic one that I created, it's still referencing this fixed measure, which we know has got a format of currency against it. If I go back into the dynamic one that I've created here, and I go back to the format string for it here, is that I've gone and modified the format string. So I'm now using a negative minus sign in the front of the negative component of the dynamic format string instead of using the brackets. So I can now use this moving forward. And so what will happen is the format string in this measure will override the currency format that was in the original measure that it was using. So that's the basics of how you go and create these dynamic format strings and to go and flip between things. But what I wanted to do is to quickly go through and explain to people is how are these format strings constructed. So when you use a numeric format string, you generally have 1 to 3 sections within the format string. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen them in Excel when you've done Excel formatting, is that if you've only got one section being used, that section will apply to all the values that you're actually formatting. If you've got 2 sections, the first section will apply to positive values and 0. The second one will be applied to any negative values that are being used. If you use 3 sections, the first one is positive, second is negative, and the third is for 0. So this can be really, really useful, particularly if you're wanting to add additional little icons in here. So for example, I'll show you some examples later where you might want to put an up arrow in for positive values, or you might want to format negative values with a down arrow, but you don't want to do anything for 0 values. So you don't have to put any icon in the third section to be applied. Then when it comes to the numeric format strings, is that you've got a 0, which is a digit placeholder, which is mandatory. So what will happen is that if you include a 0, it'll always display a digit or a 0, even if the number's got fewer digits than the format string. So for example, this top one here, I've got 0.0 and I've got a number 0.12. It'll come out as 0.1. That's what it'll be formatted as. The hash is optional, so it'll display the digit or nothing. So for example, here is that I've got a hash dot hash hash, but what will happen is any numbers that are a 0 before the decimal point are not going to be displayed. So 0.12 will be displayed as .12. Your dot is your decimal placeholder. So you've got a decimal placeholder here. And so what will happen is that that's how many digits will be displayed to the left or right of the decimal separator. Then you've got a percentage placeholder. Then you've got 1,000 separator. Now, if you put just 1,000 separator in this example here, 3 characters from the decimal point, then what will happen is you'll get a comma for your 1,000 separator. If you put the 1,000 separator in just before your decimal point, is that'll divide the number by 1,000. So however many of these you put in, it'll just keep dividing it by 1,000. So this top one here has divided this number by 1,000 to give you 1,235 thousand. If you put 3 commas, it'll divide it to give you 1 billion. And then you can also use, you can also have text strings. And what you do need to do with text strings is to put a double quotes around them, because that is really, really important, because you can end up with some very, very funky things happening, particularly when it comes to formatting currencies, which we'll get onto a bit later on. So that's the format strings. If I go on to the first one, so I've called this table-based format strings. So what I've done here is I've gone and created a number of tables here. These are just calculated tables with a whole lot of different format strings that people can use. So this particular one is the whole number. It'll be formatted this way. This is whole at 2 decimal places. It'll be formatted in this way. So different format strings that I want to apply to the actual numbers themselves. And I've also got another table here, which is called value decimals, which is then going to look at, and this particular one, I've got a whole lot of different format strings. One will be applied to numbers. One is going to be applied to currencies. One will be applied to percentage. And I've also got another one here that's going to be applying including the icon and a percentage to that particular number itself. So on this top chart here is that if I change this, all the numbers here is that because I've got it as whole numbers, the top chart here, one of the things to bear in mind, this is really, really important when you are using dynamic format strings, is that this particular chart has defaulted to using billions in the numbers. The reason for it is that if you go to the y-axis here and you go to the values, if you've got display units set to auto, the auto will override anything that you do. And so I'd always recommend that you change this over to none, because what also happens if you don't change it to none, you get some very funky things happening in your numbers. You can end up with some very weird things happening. So for example, if I change it back to auto and I change this to billions, is that what you end up finding here is that your numbers will be formatted as 0.0BNN, because you've got a dynamic format string, but Power BI has tried to auto format it at the same time. And so you've got a conflict of interest between them. So that's the one thing to be very, very careful of. One of the things that I've also found when working with it is that sometimes the visuals, the numbers will display correctly in tables, but won't get displayed correctly in charts. Other times I've also found is that the y-axis will be displayed correctly, but the labels at the data labels at the top of columns won't be displayed correctly. So if you are using dynamic format strings, do a test on a couple of variations of visuals just to make sure that they actually do what you are expecting them to do. So that's one thing to sort of bear in mind. If I just change that over, bring it back to none on here, and similarly to the bottom one here, I might want to change these over to 1 or 2 decimal places. Now, if we go into these measures themselves, is again, as I said earlier, I'm still using that total income USD measure. That was my base measure that I was using. But if I look at the format part of this, is that what this is doing is that it's going to that particular table that we've got in place to say, please find me that format string and apply that format string from that lookup table based on the slicer that we've used here. So it'll then apply that format string to the number and it'll be displayed as you've requested based on the slicer here. So in a very similar vein is that the measure that's being used for this income per donor here, same thing. I've got an original base measure here, which is using currency as its standard format. But if I go back to the table-based version and I go to the format here, it's just looking in the decimal table to say, please find me the format for the currency that I'm wanting and apply it to that number. So that's what I've called sort of just table-based, where you're just referencing a format string in a table within your report. If I then go to this next stage here, which is onto the measure-based option, in this instance here is that we may not be referencing a table, but we may want to create some very interesting modifications in the actual format strings, which you can do. Again, I'm referencing the same base measure that we used earlier. I've got a slicer on the left-hand side to change between fixed and variable. But if we now go look at the format string here, is that in this particular instance, is that what I'm wanting it to do is to say, okay, if the fixed option has been selected in the slicer, please format all the values within that matrix or table, I think it is, to say, I want to use the maximum value within that table. So for example, it's some quite interesting DAX that you can add into this dynamic format string. So for example, here is that what will happen with this one is that it'll format all the numbers based on billions, because billions is the greatest number that exists in this particular visual. If I go and filter this visual out by, for example, Africa, is that what will happen is it'll change it so everything's now in millions, because it'll be basing it on that. If I go and switch it over to variable, what will happen is your numbers will be different depending on what you've actually decided to do. So for example, the one row here might be in thousands, another row might be in millions. It just depends on what you're wanting to do. So it just gives people flexibility to do that. In this particular visual down below here, I've got another measure, which I've got, again, I've got another format string that I'm actually using here. Again, I've gone and created a whole lot of DAX within that measure to show the different how I want to format the actual data label itself. So for example, depending on what I've selected, so as I said earlier, is that you can use the selected measure within the same measure itself. So here, I'm just wanting to format it in a certain way. I've got unichar characters that I'm using here to indicate whether it's an up arrow or a down arrow. And so depending on the selection that I've made in my slicer, will then change the format string of this measure in the last column here. So for example, I've got income CY. If I change that over, I'm going to change that back again to the fixed one. If I change this, I can change it over to the income percentage change. That'll do the changeover. If I change it to this option, it'll then it'll change that format of that particular number. So it gives you a lot more dynamic ability to change things around. If I now go on to the reference measure itself, so this one here is if you've got a situation where you might not want to sort of, you might want to have a situation where you want to create all the format string, but you want to contain it in one measure and then just reference that measure for a whole lot of other measures, which is exactly what I've done in our production reports. So if I, for example, look at this particular measure here, is that I've actually, in the format string here, this is actually referencing another measure that I've actually got here. So this display unit format measure that I've actually got up here is, where is it again? I think it's in here. There we go. So in this particular one is that I'm getting it to pick up the format string from this table that we've selected, and please can you format the measure based on so the other measure is referencing this measure to format the actual values themselves. Then the one recommendation I would say is make sure you put an alternative option in here. So at least if you've got people who are using that measure, they don't have to use the slicer. They might want to use that measure in a part of their report that they don't want to have the ability for people to change things. So it's a good thing to have an alternative option if you're going to go down this route of having the a reference measure. And the bottom one here is that this doesn't actually use the slicer. So this is just using the alternate format string that we've created in the other measure itself. So that's the basics of, and going into sort of more in-depth of looking at all the different dynamic format strings options that you might want to apply. If there are any questions, then do let me know side of things, or any clarification that people want. Because what I'm wanting to do is jump onto conditional formatting now. So in this particular part of the actual report is, what if we want to give people the option of changing the colors in charts? Because often you fix the colors in charts. So for example, I've got a slicer here on the left-hand side here. It's just a calculated table that I've created. It gives people options to change what they're wanting to show. So for example, if I select no labels, it won't show me the labels, and it'll change the colors of the columns to gray. If I switch over to the highest and lowest, which I showed earlier, it'll do that. If I might want to select the first and last columns, it'll change the color formatting. If, for example, I might want to change to odds and evens, for example. Again, I've showed people the above average side of things. Now, the other option that you might want to do is I might want to show the top N in my chart. So for example, here, this numeric parameter at the bottom here is driving the top N part of this slicer up at the top here. So what this will do is that it'll find the top 5 years for this particular instance. If I change it to the bottom N, it'll find the bottom N options. What it will also do is that the top N% will also be based off of this parameter. So you can use it in multiple different ways, depending on what you're trying to do. It might be that you get the bottom end percent. It may not work in this particular instance just because of the values, that the way that everything is constructed is that the chart on the right hand side needs to go up slightly just because you've got not very many entries in there. But you can see in the middle chart by country is it will highlight the bottom 20% of the markets that I've actually, countries that I've got in that visual. And then also too is the average line here. This particular average line here is just showing the conditional formatting. So in this particular visual here is, if I go to the visualizations here and I go to the actual constant line that I've created, is that I've just got a I've got a field that I've used here called average income by year, and this one here is just applying a conditional format to it. So what will happen is, if I've selected the value, it'll show me the average value, else it'll go blank, and so the line will disappear. If we look at some of the other measures that are going into some of these other charts here, if we look at this particular one here, the income by the country one, so this one will be it's got two different options in here. This here is got the data labels. So I've got a measure that I created for the data labels. So this is the label formatting by country. So this here has got a whole nice chunk of DAX built into there. So you can actually, depending on what you've actually selected in the other one, this will then make a decision as to what color formats are actually used further down here. Now, one of the things that I tend to do is I tend to use a lot of base measures for my coloring. So I'll often create colors. So for example, in this instance here, I've got a lot of measures here. So I've got a color blue, I've got a color transparent, I've got a color red, I've got a color green. And so I've also got, there's some various other ones. So what I tend to do in a lot of my reports is that I'll create a number of measures to have some default colors. And so I've only got one place I have to change those colors. So for example, you may not use it to say color green. You might say, I want to have a color that indicates positive. I want to have a color that indicates negative in all of your reports. And so you can then use all these measures and you can reference those in various other parts of your report. If we look at the actual column formatting for the country, very similar DAX code. There's just a lot of DAX code that's going into it, and it'll do some calculations, and then depending on what happens, it'll then assign a particular color to that column within the conditional formatting tab for the actual column itself. So if we look at all the bars, it'll then go into the conditional formatting, and it's using that measure that we've actually created. So that's sort of how to add in those different conditional formatting into the actual charts themselves. Now, what I wanted to do is to sort of take it to another level now, is to look at, well, hang on, there's an option down at the bottom here to change the hex code. So in this particular option here is that what we tend to do in a lot of our reports that we've got is that, because we're dealing with a lot of organizations, is that a lot of these organizations, they want to have their own brand colors used in the charts. So we have a hex code built into the actual lookup tables. So if I just go look at this, the dim country table very quickly, is that in this particular instance, I've just assigned a random hex code to all these countries. So we do the same thing for organizations as well. And so we've got their brand colors that they've got. So a lot of our charts that we've got, they look like, yeah, there's quite a mix of colors, but unfortunately they've asked that they have their colors specified in the actual visuals themselves. So you can also change the colors around. So for example, in this chart on the right-hand side here, is that I've gone and created a measure, which is just a set measure. I can't remember which one it is. I think it's, let me just double check on this one here, is if I look at the columns here. So this column formatting by year. So what I've done in this particular instance here is that I've just gone and assigned certain colors to it. But if I look at the hex code option that I've selected down at the bottom here, is that this particular one will reference a measure that I've created at the top here, and I'm assigning a hex code to all the different years in the visual itself. So that's the sort of the basic part of doing the sort of color formatting. What happens if we want to be even more add even more flexibility for users? So one thing I wanted to just briefly cover over is different color options within Power BI. So one of the things that you can do within Power BI is that you can actually use a color name. So for example, blue. If you're wanting to color things, you can actually use the name of the color, and it'll format the colors within visuals. Another way of doing it is using the hexadecimal number, which often is this hash, and then you've got a six character, or even you can go to an 8-character hexadecimal number. The first 2 characters are the red component of the color. The second 2 are the green, and the third pair is blue. Then the 7th and 8th characters is what they call the alpha channel. This is an optional pair that you can put onto a hex code, and this will change the opacity of the color, so how transparent that color actually goes. Now, what happens with this is that each pair of your characters are hexadecimal numbers between 00 and FF. You can find them often online. There's a full listing of all the different pairings that you can find. And your letters for the hexadecimal numbers can be either lower or uppercase. Doesn't really matter. Your RGB color values come in this format where you've got a number, comma, number, comma. So for example, this instance, blue is 0,0,255. And what happens is that the first number is your red component, the second number is your green component, and your third number is your blue component. And that will specify the intensity of your color as an integer between 0 and 255. And again, with RGB color values, you can also extend them with an alpha channel as well. So you can have a number between 0.0 and 1.0. 0.0 is going to be 100% transparency. 1.0 is 0 transparency. Then you can also use another variation, which is called HSL. Now, HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And an HSL format comes with a number on a scale of 0 to 360. Then you've got 0 to 100% for your saturation, and 0 to 100% for your lightness is your third component here. So hue is your degree on the color wheel from 0 to 360. Saturation is your intensity of your color, and lightness is how much light you're wanting on your color. And again, HSL colors, you also get an option where you can include the alpha channel as well, also from 0.0 up to 1.0. Now, the reason I talk about these is that when you get to the color selection here, is that I've got all these different color options here. So for example, in the top chart here, where I'm talking about fixed, I've got a slicer here that's referencing a table, a dim color table that I've brought into the Power BI report. If I just look at that very briefly, so I've got a select list of colors, and I've got hex codes for each of those colors. So in this instance here, if I'm looking at the fixed one, is that what I'm doing here is that I'm just picking up the name of that color to format the visual on the right-hand side. So depending on what I'm picking up, it'll change that color. If I now go to this option here, the variable opacity, what happens here is that depending on the color that I've actually selected, there's a measure on the underside of this here. So if we go look at that very quickly, is that what I've done here is that depending on how many years I've selected in the visual itself, it'll change the percentage of that alpha channel that we're now using. So what will happen here is that as an asset of DAX code within here is that it'll pick up the actual number of years that I've got in this visual. So for example, is that if I go and filter this visual, so currently at the moment, I'm showing from 2015 all the way through to 2023. If I now go change this and I actually only show 2023 and 2022, the actual opacity of 2022 will change because I've now only got 2 columns that I'm showing in that in this chart. Your top column will be 100% opaque, so it won't. So it'll be 1.0 on that scale, and this one here will be 0.5 on the scale. If I now start including 21 in this, again, it'll shift the things. So this will be most probably about 30-odd%. This will be 60-odd%. This will be 100%. And then depending on what other ones I do, the opacity will just keep changing depending on what I'm actually doing within the chart itself. So if we go back to select all the years itself, so that's if you want to change. Yeah, I'll be adding the PBEX. I'll upload it to the my GitHub tonight or tomorrow, and then you can download it and have a look at it all, and then decide which bits you're actually wanting to play with. So that's the option of using. So the difference is that this first fixed one is using the color name. The second one, the variable opacity, is using a combination of the hex code and the alpha channel that we're using to get that coloring. Then the third option is looking at the RGB. So this one here is that I've got 3 slices in the chart here. I can change this around. So depending on what options you might want to give users, they could change the colors of the charts around. And depending on what numbers will change, you can just change them up and down, and that'll change the colors of the chart. Again, this option here is using the HSL options. So again, I can go and change the colors in the slices here, and that'll change the colors of the chart. If I go and change the alpha value here at the bottom, that'll go and change the opacity of the actual colors within that chart itself. So again, it gives your users even more flexibility if you're wanting to have a whole series of different color patterns or coloring that people might want to use, particularly if you might want to apply certain colors to people from an accessibility point of view. You might use certain colors in a chart to show positive and negative, but you might want to have an option to switch for somebody who might be colorblind. So for example, and they can change it over to a color palette that actually makes sense to them. So that's looking at all the color options. So that's going even deeper into making things even more flexible for your user base. So this takes us back to our chart that we started with earlier. So back to that one. So that's sort of that's all the building blocks to get to this particular stage. So it gives you a lot of variations to actually create this. But as I say, is one of the key things, like I always say to people, is just because we can doesn't necessarily mean we should on charts. Is have a look at all the different options, maybe apply 1 or 2 of them within your reports. One of the things I will say is that we've got our production reports. The fact tables are about 70 to 80 million rows of data. In one of the fact tables, we've got another fact table that's got 40 to 50 million rows, a third fact table that's got 30-odd million. And we've got a number of these particular options that I've applied, and I haven't had any performance issues within the report. So one of my advice would be to people is, if you do implement this, do some testing just to make sure that it doesn't kill your performance. So that's one thing to be careful of. What I wanted to do is to look at the next option here, which is looking at currency conversion. So this is very similar to all the other number formatting that we've used, but this is now looking at how do we format for different currencies. So for example, for ourselves, all our reports, because we've got different countries around the world, we've got different currencies that people want to view their reports in. So we've had to implement something similar, so where we can give people the flexibility to change between the different currencies that they've actually want to display data. Particularly if you've got an HQ will want to often view their data in euros or USD, whereas a lot of your specific countries want to view their income in local currency. So in this particular instance is that if we look at the converted income here, again, the converted income that I've actually got here is that I've got this converted income that I've created this measure. Again, I've got the original measure that was still in USD, but it's doing some exchange rate calculations. So in this particular one is I've actually got an exchange rate calculation table down at the bottom here in this particular report. So we've got an exchange rate calculation for all the different currencies, and depending on the year that that exchange rate is being applied for that data, it'll apply a different exchange rate for the data that you're wanting to apply it to. And then I've got a whole list of currencies that we're also using. Now, like I said earlier, is that I've also got a currency format built into this currency table. Now, one thing that it's very difficult to zoom in on here is that like I said earlier, with number formats, you can include text strings into that format. But one of the things I would say is make sure you put double quotes around any text, particularly after the numbers. Because, for example, Danish kroner has got KR dot. Now, what happens is if you don't put the double quotes around it, Power BI will try and interpret that dot as a decimal point and try and convert the number. So you end up with KRs in the middle of the number all over the place. So that's one thing to be very careful of. So if you've got any text after the numbers, put them in double quotes. If you've got any text before or any currency symbols before the numbers, you don't need to worry about the double quotes. Just leave them as is. So in this instance here is that I've got a measure here. It's got as we said earlier, dynamic format. It's going to look for that particular currency format to apply to the measure itself based on the selection that we've made in the slicer. So I've selected Canadian dollars here. So this will update all the charts to show it in Canadian dollars. I can select anything else if I want. So Danish kroner will convert all my USD amounts into Danish kroner. As for any of the other currencies I've selected, it'll go and do the exchange rate calculations that I'm needing to do, and then display the currency, the equivalent currency that I've actually requested for it to do. Again, make sure that you turn off the auto formatting on these visuals, because again, you'll end up with some very weird things going on. So in this instance, I've left it as auto and it has worked, but I found that sometimes you can get some very weird things happening with it. And so it's always best to actually turn it off to none. So that's looking at converting currency. Now, I've also got another option here, which is looking at, a lot of people want to look at locales. So locales are where you're in a particular region of the world. Now, there are people who get very picky and they want to display their data in the same format that they're used to. And this often gets picked up by your browser settings, or often in Power BI desktop, the locale gets picked up in there, and it'll show numbers, currencies, various numbers in the format of the person in that country that they're actually viewing it. But you can actually also do this within Power BI. Is that where you can actually use a set of locales to actually format your information depending on the locale that was selected. So it can override any other settings. So if I go back to this converted income locale measure here, and I go back to the format option, one of the things that to be careful of when you are looking at locales is you'll notice here that there's a double quotes around this particular part of the measure. Because what is happening is that to be able to do this is that you have to use the double quotes to ensure that a value is returned so that Power BI doesn't think it's a string. Because what happens is when you use the format function within Power BI, it'll format that number as a string. And so you cannot then use that measure on a chart, or even if you put it on a matrix, you can't then apply column formatting and things like that, because it's a string value, it's not a number value. But by putting these double quotes around this, is that what they call a string literal, is that in some ways it's sort of fooling Power BI to think that it's a number, whereas it's kind of not a number. And the only way of using a locale is by using the format function, by using the selected measure, using the currency format option and specifying the locale that you've actually got. So for example, in this instance here, English Canada, you've got your $sign at the front end, and we've got commas for the 1,000 separators. If I change it over to French Canadian, then it changes it over here, and you get rid of the commas, and you've got spaces as your 1,000 separators. And instead of using the a dot as the decimal point, you've now got a comma as the decimal point itself. So if I just open that up a bit, so you've now got a comma there instead of a dot for it. So locales can be useful, but just be aware that you can often have some limited functionality. And also too, the other thing to notice is that your y-axis gets wrecked. And I'm not sure why this happens. It's something obviously within the way it works. Even if you change your dynamic axis to none, is that it will have the same value applied on your y-axis. So just be careful when you're using locales within measures. Any sort of considerations to think about? As I said, is just be careful. Obviously, I've built this report. There's a lot of measures that I've created here. So you could end up with a PBEX that has got a lot of measures. So you end up with data model bloat with loads and loads of bespoke measures, just depending on specific use cases that you're wanting to use. A lot of these other pointers I've sort of mentioned about being careful of the y-axis. Be very careful of the performance of your measures. So like I said, do a test on it. And the other thing as well is sort of be careful of sort of any sort of reports that are connected to your sort of baseline data model. If you build your report measures, your format with dynamic formatting in your base semantic model, you can still use them in your thin report and they still work. That's how we do it with all our reports. I've added in a couple of extra links here for sort of the Microsoft Learn site and the format function. And there's also a YouTube video here that SQL BI did explaining how the performance of measures with dynamic format strings actually work. Because what happens is any measure with dynamic format strings creates two separate calls for that measure. So you end up with two queries being created. So that's one thing to be very, very careful of with measures. So that's all I've got. Any questions from anybody on any of the stuff that I've covered off?
I don't see any questions in the chat just yet, but if anybody has some, please fire them in there. Dude, I got to say that is some crazy, crazy DAX for driving some of those things. That is impressive stuff. Really cool to see this in play, though, on the different charts and the different options that you can put into to select. Wow. Would not even have tried to go down some of those routes. So, yeah, I love the creativity in this field. Like it's amazing to sort of look at things. I mean, I'm like, hey, I'm a numbers guy. Let's just get the number right. But yeah, the formatting on that is just really, really cool, Anthony. I'm definitely I'm not often left speechless, but some of that stuff was leaves me there. So,
Good.
All right, so I'm just sort of looking at the comments right now. Yep, people are looking forward to the video and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, if there's no other questions on it, Anthony, thanks so much for coming and doing this. I really appreciate having you on the show and sharing the stuff that you did here. It's pretty inspiring stuff there as well. As always, I also want to just make another shout out to Joseph for doing our What's New in Power BI at the beginning of the show. Really appreciate your work on all that stuff, Joseph. That's fantastic. And at this point, thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to end the recording here, and I will get this posted up on the SkillWave YouTube channel within the next 48 hours. You should see it show up there, and we'll message everybody at Meetup once it's live so that you can go back and take a look at what's going on there. Anthony, as far as the PBIX file, if somebody wants to download that, where would they actually find that?
It'll be on my GitHub, so take a note of that GitHub link there, and I'll upload it tonight or tomorrow morning. So if I put that in the chat quickly, it makes life, I find in the chat and stuff is a lot easier, then at least people can just hit it straight away.
It was on your last screen as well, right? That you had there.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
there we go.
Yeah.
At
So
GitHub, Antony Catella /resources. Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So, but yeah, it's just a lot of stuff. It's a lot of ideas. That's how I've sort of, like I've said, a lot of the ideas I've implemented in reports, and other ones I've just gone down a rabbit hole.
Well, and fair enough, right? I mean, that's how we get inspired to build cool things, right? So there you go. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for coming. I'm going to shut things down now. And like I say, I'll get this posted the next 48 hours. Don't forget that the next meetups are open for RSVPs. So hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Thanks all.
Thanks very much, Ken. Much appreciated.